I would like to express my gratitude to Matteo for the organization of this very stimulating seminar session on styles in the arts and science. It's a great opportunity for me to share my reflections on Gottfried Semper with you and to submit them to a collective discussion. I've seen that Marie Vatum and Kai Warner-Pratt are there, so I'm very honored of their presence. Thank you for being there. So before I begin my presentation, I just want to present myself and to precise that I'm not an art historian, but a Germanist. I work on German texts of the second half of the 19th century or of the first decades of the 20th century, more precisely on German texts on anthropology of religion and art. My approach consists in a close reading of texts. I'm trying to reconstruct the ways of their argumentation and to define precisely their logical structure. The goal of my presentation will therefore not be to analyze if Gottfried Semper was right or not, but to describe rigorously the logic of his thinking. In this communication, I will quote abundantly Semper's English translations. So Semper's style was first volume was published in 1860, was translated into English in 2004 by Harry Francis Malgrave in the collections of the Getty Research Institute. And I'll be quoting from this translation, as well as Malgrave's earlier translation of the 4 Elements of Architecture and other essays published in 1989. I'm currently preparing with my French colleague Estelle Thibault a translation of Semper's style into French, as Matteo said, and it's quite a long way. So my first point will be Semper's thesis on architecture, textile, and style. The famous thesis of German architect Gottfried Semper on the relationship between textile and architecture is founded on a demonstration which he based on 2 important theoretical steps. The first step was the discovery of traces of polychromy on ancient architecture. Before Semper, who was enthusiastic about this new finding, architect Jakob Ignaz Hittorf has observed traces of color on the rails and columns of the temple of Selinot in Sicily in the mid-1820s. From 1830 to 1833, it was Semper's turn to go to the south of France, to the south of Italy, to Sicily, and to Athens. Athens, in order to verify by himself the reality of Hittorf's statement that the marbles and stones of ancient Greek temples were not as white as the ancient statues depicted by Winkelmann. Semper confirmed that the most magnificent stones of ancient ruins often displayed traces of polychrome pigments. Back to Germany in 1834, he published a first essay, which was a vibrant plea for the polychrome party, the preliminary remarks on polychrome architecture and sculpture. His main goal was not to offer a historical reconstruction, nor a modern architectural imitation of the impressive red and blue backgrounds, which he imagined on the ancient buildings. On this slide, you can see Semper's reconstitution of a red Parthenon. What Semper had in mind was something else. Polychromy was, according to him, a sign, evidence of the functions of architectonic elements, especially walls, ceilings, floors, roofs, columns, etc. He related the use of color to specific functions of architecture, which in 1834 he was not yet able to define, but which he wanted to unravel. The historical existence of polychromy had to be demonstrated, but for Semper, it was not enough. His main interest was to explain the role of color and to find an interpretation for the necessity of the decor. 15 years later, Semper finds the way to the second theoretical major step of his demonstration. He's now able to explain the function of polychromy in ancient architecture. His thesis is that the color put on stone doesn't refer primarily or not exclusively to a symbolic function, for example, to a system of symbols associated with different colors. The function of color is not primarily symbolic, nor is it only decorative. The aesthetic dimension of polychromy is a major component of what Semper calls style. According to him, the essential function of polychromy has to do with memory, which is a dimension of style. Polychromy is a reminiscence of an origin which is more structural than strictly historical. Style has to do with memory because there is a logic of forms which refers to an history, but also to an anthropological background. From the end of the 1840s onwards, Semper identifies the origin of architecture as textile. The colors of the decors are a remembrance of this textile origin and of the colored patterns of the first textile walls, that's to say, the rugs. Semper explores his idea much later in his cardinal work, Der Stil, in 1860, but he formulates his thesis on the textile origin of architecture as early as in the late 1840s. This new conception of architecture is groundbreaking for two reasons at least. First, Semper postulates a relationship between architectural polychromy and the use of color in ancient textile, especially the juxtaposition of colored parts in rugs and carpets. The treatment of color in the architectural decor is paratactic, and this paratactic style is precisely a specific feature of textile techniques like those of rugs, embroideries or tapestry, as opposed to the mixing of colors which characterize the art of painting. This will be my first point. I will explore the consequences Semper draws from the paratactic style of architectural color. The second reason is that the relationship between architectural polychromy and textile is related to a specific spatial position, namely the vertical. Architecture has something to do with textile, but more precisely with a specific use of textile, that of hanging textile. The rug, which is for Semper the archetype of house building, is considered not in its modern ordinary use on a floor, but as a hanging rug. In the verticality of a hanging rug, Semper discovers the prototype of the wall. He proposes a completely new architectural definition of the wall based on the specificities of textile verticality, and this definition has important consequences for the conception of materiality and style. This will be my second point. The third reason is that Semper develops a very innovative way to explain the transition from one material to another, from textile to another architectural components. I will try to describe the specific properties of this Semperian conception of the relationship between textile and architecture, between one form to another form, between one decor to another decor, or from one form to another form, from one decor to another decor. Semper postulates that there is a logic in the dynamics of the formal and material memory. This logic is precisely what he calls style. I think that Caroline Van Eck, my colleague of Cambridge, is right when she says that Semper's theory of the Stoffwechsel, or of the metabolism, has something rational, that Semper believes in a rationality of these artistic processes, in contrast with Warburg and his conception of the irrationality of the form migrations. Semper's concept of style, which has nothing to do with an history of the artistic styles in plural, is always in singular because of this rationalist background. A background which has its limits too. This will be my last point. So I come now to a new point, architecture and the power tactical style in the use of color. During his journey in France, Italy and Greece, one of the first places Semper chose to stop at was the French Roman city of Orange in Provence, where he sketched and analyzed an ancient Roman mosaic pavement. The technique of mosaic is interesting for Semper because it exemplifies a very pure power-taxis of colors. The cut stones or tesserae create perfectly clear lines of separation between the contrasting colors, white, black, yellow, green, and red. Semper describes color power-taxis as an optic phenomenon. The colors are not mixed together on the material surface, they exclude each other, but simultaneously they are not seen only as separate. The eye is able to mix them while perceiving them as distinct. As seen from a certain distance, the juxtaposition of colors creates a new refined tone. Semper's concept of polychromy, therefore, is based not only on a reflection on the color of architecture as opposed to a neutral or white image of antique buildings, but also and more precisely on a reflection on the optic phenomena which occur in front of colors. He's mainly interested in the representation of colors, in the processes of their mixture, not under the painter's brush, but in the eye of the spectator. The plurality of the polychromy is essential. It's not a random mix of colors. For Semper, the confrontation of tones in ancient polychromy is an organized one. Colors react to other ones, but these forms of resonance can only be obtained if the parataxis of tones follows certain optic laws. The relationships between colors can be described as a system, but as a system with many possible combinations, not as a closed system. What Semper calls style is always defined in the confrontation of two elements, in this case, in the confrontation of two colors. The complete series of colors used in a decor is never predictable, but there are limited possibilities for the choice of two conjunct colors. Style is therefore normative, but only at a certain scale, at a limited one. In the confrontation of two consecutive elements. The rationality of style is limited to such micro-sequences. It can't be extended to a more universal scale. The discovery of Pompeii, according to Semper, was not only a revelation about the polychromy of ancient decor, but also about the system of colors used in this decor. One of its most striking features was the fresh and vivid tones of the colored surfaces. The ancients never used half tones in their homes and buildings in general. I quote Semper. In a bright, consuming southern light and strongly tinted environment, the effect of refraction on well-ordered tones of color placed next to one another is so mild that the colors don't offend the eye, but soothe it. The secret lies in arranging the colors in such a way as not to harm each other. The recently excavated rooms at Pompeii show how adept the ancients were in applying the brilliantly pure colors. And indeed, we begin to become accustomed to them. The ancients in their decoration knew no subdued halftones of color. The blending and mixing took place not on the palette, but on the wall, through the juxtaposition of variegated and graceful decorations that, at a certain distance, appear to the eye as intermixed, but that always retain a tender playfulness that has such a charming effect. The evocation of the recently excavated rooms at Pompeii is here characteristic of Semper's approach, which is constantly reflexive and takes into account the historicity of perception. The blinding purity of the Pompeian colors contrasts with the conventional image of ancient constructions and their soft and creamy patina, which tends to obliterate the fact that the colors were used as large monochrome surfaces. The appearances of perception have to be rectified by a hermeneutics of the ancient decor, by a science of its interpretation. Semper's concept of vision is therefore historicized and critical. This faculty is not reduced to a passive registration of colored signals. It's always, in a Kantian vein, an interpretation of the perceived objects. Semper insists on the extraordinary creative potential of color associations, and he's not the first one to do so. His thoughts on juxtaposition principles were grounded in a fundamental work which had been first published in 1839. De la loi du contraste simultané des couleurs et de l'assortiment des objets colorés by Michel Eugène Chevreul. The Principles of Harmony and Contrast of Colors and Their Applications to the Art, whose German translation, published in 1847, is explicitly quoted by Semper. Chevreul, a chemist, was then director of the dye houses at the Gobelin factory. In the foreword of his study, Chevreul related that many private owners of Gobelin tapestries claimed about the blemishing of certain colors, and he argued that this transformation was not due to a real fading process, but to an optical phenomenon that he analyzes in the book. The consequences of the juxtaposition of colors, or of what he called the phenomenon of simultaneous contrast. Chevreul describes the incidence of other factors, especially of time and duration of vision, on the effects of colors, and wants to develop a technique to rationally, quote, to rationally control these contrasts through the choice of adequate tones. Chevreul's ideas inspired Owen Jones in his project for the polychrome decor of the Crystal Palace in 1851, in which he implemented the system of juxtaposition of large colored surfaces. According to Semper, the power taxis of colors is not a more or less schematic surrogate or primitive ancestor of oil painting. He reverses the perspective and argues that easel painting is a derivative of an art which has been the greatest art in ancient times, wall painting. And this reversal is not the only one. Wall painting, in turn, is seen as deriving from a textile prototype. The principle of color juxtaposition originates, Semper argues, in the constraints of the textile decor. The great originality of Semper's theory of polychromy lies in the fact that the vanishing point of his demonstration is not color itself, but textile as focus point of the whole genealogy he's now able to reconstruct. The color power taxis is a sign which refers to a genealogy of techniques. Semper finally elucidates the enigma of polychromy. It's the trace of the primacy of textile. The paradoxical disposition and style is, in fact, not indifferent about its material support. Semper discovers its prototype in a specific textile technique, the use of parallel yarns in Oriental embroidery. Semper's seminal experience is the encounter with the bas-relief of Oriental palaces, which were excavated for the first time in the 1840s. Parts of their decor arrived at the Musée du Louvre and at the British Museum precisely during Semper's stay in Paris and London, and he was among the first Europeans to be able to see them at the end of this decade. He was fascinated by the clothes of the Assyrian kings on the stone reliefs, especially their embroidered coats. They were so minutely sculptured that Semper could observe the technique used, and conclude that embroidery had reached a high degree of refinement in these Oriental textiles. The principle of this Oriental technique was the parallelism of yarns, which were not crossed as in European embroidery techniques. According to Semper, the difference between these two practices of embroidery accounted for two different types of design. In the first case, that's to say in Oriental and Asian embroidery, the design was more figurative and illustrative. In the second case, the most ancient forms of European embroidery, there was a more abstract, geometrical and decorative design. We should therefore not simplify Semper's conceptions and claim that he postulates an antagonism between the geometricality of the Oriental decor, as in the design of rugs, and the more figurative decor of European tapestry, for example. For him, the latter is in fact derived from the ancient Oriental embroidered tapestry and from its figurative decor. Semper assumes a historical continuity, or in his words, a miraculous continuity in the discontinuity from the Assyrian decor to European medieval tapestry. He sees the emergence of a pictorial principle in the broad illustrative tone of representation on Assyrian and Babylonian carpets. I quote, "This principle recurs in the alabaster reliefs of Nineveh, and then, after many centuries and under totally different social conditions, miraculously reappears almost completely unchanged in the earliest medieval tapestry, weavings, and canvas paintings." The observation of Chinese embroideries played a crucial role in Semper's discovery. He makes an analogy, or more precisely, a confusion between the Chinese embroideries he was able to contemplate and probably to touch at the London Great Exhibition of 1851 and the Assyrian reliefs he saw at the Louvre and at the British Museum. I quote, "In 1851, I saw examples of this art of embroidery at the Great Exhibition in London. They reminded me so much of the well-known bas-relief of Nineveh in their style and treatment that I've since been unable to see the latter as anything other than ancient Assyrian carpet embroidery translated into alabaster. Indeed, similar relief embroideries of a more recent date closely resemble antediluvian Chinese tapestries in their style." This text demonstrates very explicitly that Semper's acception of genealogy is not historical in a literal sense. He thinks not in terms of linear or evolutionist succession. Instead, he draws lines that go back and forth between past and present, present and past, and between different cultures. We can also notice that he defines these lines as translation processes, here translated into alabaster. I'll come back to this point a bit later. In the very ancient paradoxical technique of flat embroidery, the Chinese didn't only use silk yarns, but also small pieces of monochrome silk fabric or even feathers. I quote Semper, the frequent references to feeders indicate that they were used for embroidery. Flat embroidery, still a favorite of contemporary Chinese women, was at the time still opus plumarium in the strict sense of the word. Embroidery took the place of painting and was older than it. If painting is understood to mean more than a simple coating, a kind of color composition executed on surfaces. This is as certain as the fact that wood panels and wallpaper are of a later origin than drapery and woven wall dressing. The oldest Chinese colored embroidery was thus flat stitch executed on a ground of colored fabric with feeders. Why does Semper insist so vigorously on the Chinese use of feeders? Probably for two reasons. The first one has to do with a technical problem, the transition between surface and volume, or the genealogy of relief, of sculpture. I quote Semper, the characteristic feature of this feeder embroidery is the flat grandeur of the design over the surface of the material, amounting to a sort of polychrome bas-relief. The thickness of the embroidery creates a relief. In the economy of Semper's demonstration, it hints at the possibility of a textile genealogy, not only of architecture and painting, but also of sculpture. The scope of the textile thesis thus expands considerably, and I'll examine the consequences of this extension in my next section. Semper's argumentation on polychromy and its textile prototype doesn't lead him to assert that they both have a natural origin, but leads him rather to an anthropological conclusion. The juxtaposition of natural colors is a human artifact. Only human beings create connections between different colors. This is their way to organize nature. Semper opposes the artificial character of power taxes to any conception of an organic origin and a natural fusion of colors. Even the most basic vegetal hedges, in which Semper sees the first form of textile, with their weaving of vegetal fibers, are definitely artifactual. The hedge, as one of the first examples of polychromy, based on the natural diversity of the colors of the stalks, has already to do with what Semper calls style, that's to say, an adequacy with natural materials which doesn't reproduce the natural diversity, but organize it in patterns. That's the way Semper summarizes the invention of weaving. I quote, first with gross stalks or natural plant fibers, later with spun threads made from vegetable or animal stuffs. The diversity of natural color in the stalks soon led to their use in alternating arrangements, resulting in the pattern. And I come now to my next point, Semper's conception of the wall and of its representative function. Power taxis is more than the formal structure of polychromy in architecture. For Semper, it's in a more fundamental way the principle of architecture in general, a principle which he formulates as early as in 1851 in the 4 elements of architecture. In this text, Semper concludes to a dissociation between the components of architectural constructions. Walls, roofs, and floors are associated with different functions and different practical arts like textile, carpentry, and masonry. Moreover, these elements of houses or buildings don't work together, but separately. They are independent from each other. In order to demonstrate this idea, Semper logically looks for examples where such a dissociation can be observed. And he finds the best illustration of his thesis in ancient Chinese architecture. The ancient building principle or power taxis principle Semper has in mind has been kept alive, I quote, Semper, has been kept alive in China down to the present day, as he explains in the section of style dedicated to China, section 65. I quote Semper, the elements of Chinese architecture are not linked organically, nor even quasi-chemically, but they are held together mechanically without a leading idea. Or rather, the idea dominating the whole is expressed precisely in the separation and independent activity of these elements. In the Chinese house, Semper finds a proof of the legitimacy of one of his most striking arguments, the definition of the wall as, I quote, as movable and completely independent of the roof load. In this case, the roof is supported by pillars or columns and not by the walls, which don't touch the roof. There is an empty space between wall and roof in Chinese architecture. In its upper sections, I quote Semper, the wall supports only its own load and serves as an infill screen between the wooden supports. The latter serve the technical purpose of supporting both the roof and the room's horizontal ceiling. Strictly speaking, the wall itself is a Spanish wall executed in tile, a support for wall paper, that's to say for the decor. And Semper adds, the interior domestic furnishings are movable, usually actual carpets hung on the walls, or woolly lattice work, or wooden panels fastened together with hinges, which can be set up as desired. Sometimes there are fixed screens that allude to the character of these carpets and Spanish walls. Semper's deconstruction of the conventional association between wall and mass or massivity with its specific material, stone, offers a completely new perspective on architectural constructions. I quote Semper, the wall as such, and that's the wall as such, that's the wall as stone construction and as load bearing, vertically supporting, statically functioning element, appears only in the terraces and foundations that often form massive and essential components of Chinese architecture. Arguing that the first construction or manifestation of the structive impulsion or the constructive impulsion was not the construction of a stone wall, but the hanging of a fabric or of a carpet, Semper doesn't take over the Vitruvian thesis according to which the stone wall is a petrification of a wooden construction. Semper's specific argument is more the mobility of the first walls and constructions, as symbolized in the rug. The hanging rug, in its verticality, reveals the function of the wall. It has to separate a closed space provisionally to separate the inside and the inside from the outside in order to enclose and to protect. Like a viewer, like a skin, the hanging textile in its verticality is a protective barrier against what is now the outside. I quote Semper's style, section 9, the cover. The need for protection, cover, and spatial enclosure supplied some of the earliest inspiration for industrial invention. Human beings first learned to recognize the essence and purpose of natural covers, shaggy animal skins, protective tree bark, and began to use them for their own ends according to their correctly perceived natural use. Later, they imitated them with synthetic weaving. The concepts of covering, protecting, and enclosing are indissolubly connected with those natural and synthetic covers and dressings that have become the sensible sign for those concepts. As such, they form perhaps the most important element in the symbolism of architecture. The terms sensible signs, concepts, and symbolism are here keys to Semper's argumentation. The protection he refers to is primarily symbolic, and the symbol is even more effective when it's embodied by a hanging textile rather than by a massive stone wall. The function of architecture is above all to symbolize before it even offers physical protection. Architecture is a representation. I quote Semper, the wall is the architectural element that formally represents and makes visible enclosed space as such, absolutely. And I quote another time Semper, even where solid walls were necessary, they remain only the inner and unseen support for the true and legitimate representation of the spatial idea, which is the more or less artfully woven and knitted textile wall. So what we can here keep in mind is that Semper insists on the disjunction between the elements of architecture, like between wall and roof. Generally speaking, the logic of parataxis implies the juxtaposition of disjunct elements whose conjunction has its logic but no necessity at all. The logic of the transition between different matters can be called style because a choice is possible. Second point, the function of architecture is defined by Semper as a function of representation, as a symbolic function, as a form of reflexivity. And now, in the last and very brief part of my lecture, I want to analyze the consequences of my previous remarks while focusing on the dynamics of material memory and style in Semper's perspective. So it will be my last point, style and memory. At the end of this presentation, I can't fail to ask two very simple questions related to Semper's thesis. If architecture really is an inheritance of a textile origin, why don't we live in textile tents or nomadic textile houses anymore? The second question is linked to the first one. If we don't live in textile houses anymore, why do we need a polychrome decor to remind us of the textile origin of architecture? Semper's textile thesis can hardly be demonstrated in a concrete way, since textile is precisely the most fragile and evanescent material. The proofs of the legitimacy of Semper's hypothesis have vanished. But for him, this lack of material evidence is not a problem at all, because he's able to see traces of a textile presence everywhere. Above all, there is one fundamental reason why he doesn't need to find physical evidence. Ultimately, Semper asks us to relinquish the quest for the material core of the architectural decor, the quest of what must be under the surface. For Semper, architecture has always been a surface since its textile beginnings. What he calls the principle of dressing, the architectural necessity to dress or to cover the structive parts, has been active throughout the history of architecture, even in its textile prototypes. When Semper insists on the fact that embroidery is older than tapestry weaving, he suggests again that the principle of dressing, the superposition of a material over another material, is at work even in textile itself and originates in textile itself. The correlate of the paratactic nature of textile is the necessity to dissociate its colored parts, but also the impossibility to dissociate the decor and the elements on which it's dressed. Two materials are associated together as different and discontinuous, but also as inseparable. We can now answer the two questions we have just formulated. The differentiation of the material components of architecture, the transition between textile and other materials like wood, stone, or concrete is no treason, but the confirmation of the textile principle at work. From the beginning, the opus plumarium has been an association of heterogeneous materials like feathers and silk, for example. The material metamorphosis is the principle of the life of architecture, which connects discontinuous components. At the same time, Semper doesn't describe this metamorphosis as aleatory. There is a logic in the transition from one material to another. What kind of logic? For Semper, it's not a logic in an evolutionary sense, in the sense of an evolution. It's not a succession of materials of increasing solidity, nor a process like the Vitruvian petrification. It's a logic of reminiscence. The transition from one material to another has to do with the possibility of an analogy, of a way to represent the preceding material or to allude to it. According to Semper, we have to pay attention to the role of memory in the use of decors, colors, ornaments, and architectural materials. Semper always considers the elements of architecture as reminiscences, as symbolizations of something which is remembered. this architectural memory is constantly linked not to specific events in the history of the people who live in it, but to the memory of architecture itself. It refers to another building material. In this sense, Semper insists on the artistic autonomy of architecture. It never ends to hint at its own past and future, at its own way of transformation from one material to another, what Semper calls style, thus defining it as an art of transition. These material translations are not a marginal phenomenon, they are, on the contrary, absolutely necessary to keep the memory of architecture alive, Semper argues. For him, living memory implies disjunctions, motions in space, recompositions, and paradoxically, a nomadic status of architecture and its components. Semper is therefore interested in architecture as a collective human memory, but not in only in the sense of monuments of the so-called great history. The collective history he's interested in is embodied in the heart of matter, at a visible but also at an invisible material level. The logic of the transition from one form to another is not a teleology nor a necessary evolution. New possibilities are always open, but it's a logic of continuity between all the times and all the people. That's the point. Style is the link of this continuity. It's an anthropological continuity, but also an history with constant, unpredictable changes. And a history which has to be reconstructed step by step, because only the logic of the transition from one form to another can be defined as rational, as style. In this sense, style is the continuity of this historical and anthropological memory. Semper insists on the nomadic character of the history of techniques, which is a link throughout the history of peoples. Movements, transformations, migrations are necessary for the life of style. And Semper's theory of textile remembrance is pointing to a collective dressing, to the continuity of a collective dressing. I quote Semper: everything closed, protected, enclosed, enveloped, and covered presents itself as unified, as a collective, as something uniformly inclusive. And I think that Semper's concept of style refers to this inclusivity and continuity. Thank you.